On the 14th of June, I went on board to arrange some matters in my stateroom on the packet ship Independence. I found that we were to have a great many passengers. On the list were several of my acquaintances, and among other names, I was rejoiced to see that of Mr. Cornelius Wyatt, a young artist for whom I entertained feelings of warm friendship. I observed that his name was carded upon 3 staterooms, and upon again referring to the list of passengers, I found that he had engaged passage for himself, wife, and 2 sisters, his own. The staterooms were sufficiently roomy, and each had 2 berths, one above the other. These berths, to be sure, were so exceedingly narrow as to be insufficient for more than 1 person. Still, I could not comprehend why there were 3 staterooms for these 4 persons. The morrow having arrived, Captain Hardy met me and said that, owing to circumstances, he rather thought the Independence would not sail for a day or 2, and that when all was ready he would send up and let me know. This I thought strange, for there was a stiff southerly breeze, but as the circumstances were not forthcoming, although I pumped for them with much perseverance, I had nothing to do but to return home and digest my impatience at leisure. I did not receive the expected message from the captain for nearly a week. It came at length, however, and I immediately went on board. There were the 2 sisters, the bride, and the artist, the latter in one of his customary fits of moody misanthropy. I confess that I was very profoundly astonished. I should have been much more so, however, had not long experience advised me not to trust with too implicit a reliance the enthusiastic descriptions of my friend the artist when indulging in comments upon the loveliness of woman. When beauty was the theme, I well knew with what facility he soared into the regions of the purely ideal. The truth is, I could not help regarding Mrs. Wyatt as a decidedly plain-looking woman. If not positively ugly, she was not, I think, very far from it. She was dressed, however, in exquisite taste, and then I had no doubt that she had captivated my friend's heart by the more enduring graces of the intellect and soul. She said very few words, and passed at once into her stateroom with Mr. W. As we were almost constantly on a wind, and the breeze was not a little stiff, the ship heeled to leeward very considerably, and whenever her starboard side was to leeward, the sliding door between the cabins slid open, and so remained, nobody taking the trouble to get up and shut it. But my berth was in such a position that when my own stateroom door was open, as well as the sliding door in question, and my own door was always open on account of the heat, I could see into the after cabin quite distinctly, and just at that portion of it, too, where were situated the staterooms of Mr. Wyatt. I clearly saw Mrs. W. about 11 o'clock upon each night, steal cautiously from the stateroom of Mr. W. and enter the extra room. She remained here until daybreak. When she was called back by her husband, she went back. At night I could hear sounds occasioned by the artist prying open the oblong box. Everything else around was silent except for a low sobbing or murmuring sound. I'm not sure if I was actually hearing these, or if I was imagining it. Just before dawn, on each of the 2 nights of which I speak, I distinctly heard Mr. Wyatt replace the lid upon the oblong box, and force the nails into their old places by means of the muffled mallet. Having done this, he issued from his stateroom, fully dressed, and proceeded to call on Mrs. W. from hers. We had been at sea 7 days, and were now off Cape Hatteras when there came a tremendously heavy blow from the southwest. After the remaining passengers got off the ship into safety, we got on board our safety boat. That is when Mr. Wyatt demanded that they go back to retrieve his oblong box. I listened as the captain ordered him to sit, but he stood and sprang over the edge. While we gazed in astonishment, he passed rapidly several turns of rope, first around the box and then around his body. In another instant, both body and box were in the sea, disappearing suddenly, at once, and forever. I watched with an aching feeling in my heart as the ship sank below the surface and joined Mr. Wyatt at the bottom of the sea. About a month after the loss of the Independence, I happened to meet Captain Hardy in Broadway. Our conversation turned naturally upon the disaster, and especially upon the sad fate of poor Wyatt. I thus learned the following particulars. The artist had engaged passage for himself, wife, two sisters, and a servant. On the morning of the 14th of June, his wife suddenly sickened and died. The young husband was frantic with grief, but circumstances imperatively forbade the deferring of his voyage to New York. It was necessary to take to her mother the corpse of his adored wife. The captain arranged that the corpse first be partially embalmed and packed with a large quantity of salt. The body was to be put in an oblong box and carried as merchandise on the ship. Nothing was to be said of the lady's decease, and as it was well understood that Mr. Wyatt had engaged passage for his wife, it became necessary that some person should personate her during the voyage. This the deceased lady's maid was easily prevailed on to do.